Hey y'all, howdy. Welcome to One for the Books. I'm Sandra Broadwell, and welcome to my first wrap-up of 2023. I read 12 books and finished half of another one, so it's been a big reading month. 4 of them were novellas, but they still count. Every single book that I read this month was part of a series, which was interesting. I don't think I normally only read series, but that's just how it worked out this month. On to the books. The first book I read is An Absolutely Remarkable Thing by Hank Green. This is about a woman named April, and she lives in New York City, and she's walking home at like 2 o'clock in the morning, and she sees this giant statue that I think she describes as like a samurai transformer that was not there like when she went to work that day. And she's like, oh my gosh, this thing just showed up. And she calls up her friend who likes to film videos about random things, and they both went to art school, and she's like, you gotta come check out this cool art sculpture that just appeared here. Her friend meets her there, they film this silly little video, and April is the person in the video, and she's like pretending to interview the statue, and she's just like being silly and goofy about it. And she names it Carl. The next morning when she wakes up, her friend had posted the video, and it has like 1 million views or something, because turns out this statue is identical to 64 other statues that all appeared overnight simultaneously in like the 64 most populous cities around the planet. No one knows where they came from. There's no footage of them appearing. They're just like not there 1 minute and they are there the next minute. No one can figure out like who organized this, what are they? Over the course of a few days, they learned that these samurai transformer statues who have not moved or done anything are alien technology. They're made of materials that are not on Earth. So April becomes kind of this sensation overnight. She becomes very famous because she was the person who broke the story. And so as soon as people started hearing news about it, of course they Google it and they see her video. So she is the person basically who made first contact with an alien technology or species. And that obviously completely upends her life. She becomes famous. She has all this pressure all of a sudden where people are looking to her as sort of an expert. She's getting asked to come on all these podcasts and news channels, and people want to talk to her about it. Shortly after the alien statues appear, everyone on the planet starts having the same dream. And this kind of splits people into two sort of thought factions. The first one, whose spokesperson is April, the main character, are excited about this. They think it's really cool. The aliens are talking to us through our dreams. This is really inspiring. This is changing the world. This is changing the future of humanity. All these things. The other thought faction is this is really horrifying and scary, and aliens are infiltrating and changing our minds, and we don't know what the result is going to be. It's really dangerous. They're like of the opinion that humanity has been infected by aliens. So as much as this story is like a first contact story, it's more about April herself and how she deals with her sudden fame and how society handles and has backlash. It really turns into a story about power and the influence of power, how fame is a form of power that can be wielded to influence others for positive or negative, and how that changes a person when they're being scrutinized for everything that they do. I really liked this, but I also thought that April, the main character, was completely insufferable. She was a little too voicey in the narrative, which I found annoying, but she also was just like really self-centered and wasn't always the best person to her friends who were being there for her and supporting her. I just didn't like her. And I think part of the reason I didn't like her is probably because I saw aspects of myself that I don't like about myself in her. And I just think Hank Green did a really good job with this, holding up a mirror to our society in this day and age through the lens of aliens. The second book in the series, it's a duology, so there's only 2 books. The second book was called Beautifully Foolish Endeavor. It is hard to talk about the plot because plot is completely springboarded off of the way that book 1 ends. But in book 2, we get multiple points of view, and the points of view are April's friends from book 1. And for me, that was a big benefit to the second book because I found all of her friends to be a lot more likable and a lot more interesting than April herself. And also April goes through a significant amount of growth. She has a really great character arc in book 2, and so because of those reasons, I really liked book 2 a lot more than I liked the first one. The downside of all these different points of view characters is that they all felt a little bit too samey in some areas. They blurred together, they didn't have as unique voices as you would expect, and sometimes when a character was having a thought or saying a thing, I really just read it as Hank Green talking through the pages. And possibly that's just a side effect of me being a fan of Vlogbrothers and listening to Hank Green talk a lot on YouTube. And maybe that would not be an issue for someone who was picking this book up without being a fan of Hank Green. But despite all of that, I thought this was really, really well done. It was exciting. It was unputdownable. I actually stayed up late to finish this book, which, like, I love my sleep. I do not, like, as much as I read, I do not stay up late to read books most of the time. That's a really, really huge rarity for me. And so the fact that this book was so engaging, I think really speaks highly to the writing. I also thought that the themes and technology that this book was playing with felt a lot more near future or closer to our real world reality, because it was a lot about like kind of virtual reality and artificial intelligence and those sorts of things. Felt really similar to things that we're dealing with now. And so in that respect, I thought book 2 was like a really interesting think piece in terms of our society and our culture today. Overall, really enjoyed this series. Would recommend, especially for people who think they don't like sci-fi or people who want to dip their toe in the water of sci-fi, but they're like too intimidated by the hard sci-fi or the really intense sci-fi. These are super accessible, very contemporary, and I think they would be a good entry point into the genre. Then I read the Book of the Ice series by Mark Lawrence, and that starts with The Girl and the Stars. This series is a companion series to the Book of the Ancestor trilogy, which I read in 2022, and I loved the Book of the Ancestor. This series technically takes place before the Book of the Ancestor, but the books were written after, and the author has said that you could read them in any order. And while I definitely think that is true, I would not start with this series. I would start with Book of the Ancestor because, in my opinion, Book of the Ancestor is a much better trilogy than this one is. So I really don't think this one has a ton to offer unless you're already a fan of Book of the Ancestor and just want to dive deeper into this world. In general, I thought the series was solid, but not something to just like rush out and put on your TBR. This series is, or this world, I guess, is what you would classify as sci-fantasy or future fantasy. It feels very much like a fantasy world with like magics and things like that, but the more you learn about the world, the more you learn this world was colonized by interplanetary explorers like thousands of years ago, and the remnants of that society and their technologies and their cities that are ruined all over the planet are basically the source of the magics. The planet is also like 95% covered in ice. The only like habitable green zone of the planet is like a tiny strip around the equator of the planet, and it's growing smaller and smaller every year. The Book of the Ancestor is about the societies that live within that equatorial zone, and those people believe that the ice is completely uninhabitable. The Book of the Ice obviously is about the tribes of people who live on the ice. And those people live thousands of miles away from the equator and really have no idea that there is like a habitable green zone on the planet. There is some creation myths that they have in their tribes about how the world used to be green, but they are so far removed from it, they don't know that it's there. So the main character in the Book of the Ice series is a 16-year-old girl named Yaz. ice. She is from a very hardy ice tribe, and the ice tribes have this shared event that they do like once every 4 years. It's led by basically like a cult of priests who bring all the ice tribes together like once every 4 years to get rid of their weaklings. Because living on the ice is so hard, there's no room for weakness. And there are people on this planet who have magical abilities. And those magical abilities, because of the way they work, if people on the ice show those signs of being magically inclined through their genetics, then they will not survive. They are not hardy enough to live on the ice. So once every 4 years, basically, they get together, the priests of this little cult examine all of the children, and they can tell which ones are magical, and all the children that are magical are basically thrown down into a hole in the ice to die. It's like a bottomless pit, basically. It's a very brutal society and culture, but they try to weed out these magical children so that their gene stock can survive on the ice. So the story basically kicks off when Yaz's younger brother is thrown into the hole, and without thinking, she just dives in after him in order to rescue him. And what she finds when she gets down there is that nothing is what she thought it was when she lived up on the ice. It turns out that people who are thrown down in the hole usually don't die right away, and they actually have an entire society that they've built under the ice. She starts to uncover this conspiracy about the priests and how they're controlling the tribes of the ice by lying to them. This first book, I think, just had too much happening. There was catastrophe after catastrophe after catastrophe, and I just felt like I didn't have room to breathe between all of these bad things that were thrown at the characters. It evened out a little bit in the second half of the book, but in general, I just felt like the pacing was a little all over the place in this book. It did end on an exciting cliffhanger, but I felt like the strongest part of this book was the world building itself and not necessarily the plot or the characters. Dove straight into The Girl in the Mountain, which is book 2. In this one, Yaz has basically uncovered a lot of the mysteries under the ice, and she escapes to go confront the cult of priests who were controlling the ice tribes and try and get to the bottom of the conspiracy and figure out what's really going on. That was the synopsis of what happens on the back, and then that plot wrapped up like halfway through the book, which I was like really surprised by. And then the second half of the book is basically like a quest for the characters, because they have rumors now, they have heard of the fact that there might actually be like an equatorial green zone that is habitable, and they want to try and get there. And so the second half of the book is them on that journey. This one also ends on a pretty exciting cliffhanger, and the world building that took place in book 1 really starts to pay off in this book. The final book in the series is The Girl and the Moon, and I also thought this was the strongest book in the series. This book takes place entirely within the green equatorial zone that they have heard about in the previous books. And this one definitely has really strong ties to the Book of the Ancestor series. There are some setting and character elements that are the same between this book and the other trilogy. Again, this had a lot of really cool world building, setting, magic stuff that I found really cool, and I thought this was the strongest of the 3 books. But that being said, I still don't think this book is as good as any of the 3 books in the Book of the Ancestor. So again, overall, I thought this was super solid. I'm glad that I read it, but I would highly recommend reading the Book of the Ancestor first, and then if you really have a strong appetite for more, dive into the Book of the Ice. After reading the Book of the Ice, I then dove into the Murderbot Diaries, which was a new series for me, and I actually read the first 5 books of this series this month. So most of the Murderbot books are novellas. The first 4 were, and then the 5th book was the first one that was a full-length novel around 350 pages. It starts with All Systems Red, and then the next 3 are Artificial Condition, Rogue Protocol, Exit Strategy, and then number 5 is Network Effect. So this is a science fiction series about a half-human, half-robot construct whose purpose is to be a security unit for a corporation that rents it out to other smaller corporations that go on like planetary explorations, and its whole job is to basically like make sure none of its clients get killed while they're doing whatever it is they do on the planet. The security units are not considered people, they are considered cargo, and they have basically no rights. The main character is a security unit that has named itself Murderbot, and it has disabled its governor module, which means it has independent thought and feelings and desires, and it doesn't have to follow the protocols that it was designed to. But it doesn't want anyone to know that it has hacked its governor module, because if its company that owns it finds out, then they would permanently disable it. Obviously, it's a bad thing for a security unit that can murder people to go rogue. So it keeps working for the company that owns it. It keeps going on these missions, but in the background, it's just downloading a whole bunch of TV shows and watching them on its free time, and just trying to live a happy little life and not murder people. Murderbot also has a lot of anxiety about being discovered, but also just about interacting with humans. It feels really uncomfortable around people, because people generally feel really uncomfortable around security units because they're murdering machines. And there's just some really cute things that happen where, because it gets so much anxiety when people try to talk to it, that it'll like stare above their heads or like turn around and stare at the wall to try and discourage people from interacting with it, which as an introvert, I totally understand and really do. The world of Murderbot is also kind of dystopian and bleak, at least in the backdrop. Most planets are owned by corporations, and most people are kind of indentured servants to those corporations. So that makes for a really interesting world. Despite all of that, and despite like lots of murder and fighting that happens, the series feels really cozy, because Murderbot is silly and has a fun sense of humor, and it really is about like discovering yourself and making friends and things like that. I would consider the first 4 novellas in the series to be like one complete arc if you see them all together. And so if you were looking to dip your toes into Murderbot and you wanted to read the first one but not necessarily like all of them at the same time, I think 1 through 4 make like a good capsule of the experience. Basically in books 2 and 3, Murderbot is just going on like one-off quests. It's making some friends, and actually book 3 ends on like a really sad note, but book 4 is the one that kind of ties up a lot of the things that were kicked off in book 1. And then book 5, Network Effect, is, like I said, the first full-length novel of the series, and this one in a lot of ways is really similar to the other ones, except that it has a lot more of the characters you've come to know and love all together in one place in this one. But you know, it still has the same formula of like Murderbot goes on a mission, things go horribly wrong, Murderbot has to rescue a lot of people and not die in the process. This one also developed the world a little bit more in terms of, in previous novellas, we heard a little bit about alien remnants being found on some of the planets, and this one dives into that a little more deeply, and we get to learn more about the alien remnants and how they affect the corporations and the governments and the people who are on the planets where those things are found, which was really interesting. Honestly, this series is like not spectacularly written or anything, and in a lot of ways, all of the entries feel a little bit samey, but it scratches a very particular itch, and if you have that itch, then this scratches it really well. It's really fun. I really enjoy it. I'm definitely going to continue in the series. There are 2 more Murderbot books that have been published so far, so I will be reading those sometime soon. And then I think there's planned to be eventually 10 total in the series, so it is still an ongoing series, and I'm looking forward to continuing hanging out with Murderbot. After Murderbot, I read book 2 of the Emily Wilde series, which was Emily Wilde's Map of the Otherlands. The first book was Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies, which I just read in December. In this one, Emily is trying to find and prove the existence of a fairy door called a nexus, which she believes is a door that will lead to multiple different places within the realm of fairy. Everyone knows fairy doors exist, but no one has ever proved that a nexus door exists. In this one, her companion and fellow scholar Wendell Bamblebee has returned along with her on this journey. There's also also the introduction of some new characters like Emily's niece and another professor from Cambridge who thinks that Emily's research methods are very unorthodox and possibly false. So he's a bit of a rival that she is butting heads with in this one. At the same time of them going on this journey and trying to find this nexus, fairies are also trying to assassinate Wendell because of events that took place in book 1. So this one has all of the charm that the first book did. It has wonderful characters and fiendish fae creatures and unsettling trips into the fae realm and further development of our romantic subplot. If you loved the first one, which I did, then you will definitely love this one too. After that, I read The Heroes by Joe Abercrombie, which is book 5 in the First Law world. This is also my favorite First Law book thus far. They have each gotten better in my opinion, and I really hope that trajectory continues as I move on to the final 4 books of the series. This whole book is about one battle between the Union and the North. It's about the lead up to the battle itself, and the aftermath. Joe Abercrombie is the only author I could think of that could pull this off so well. It switches between points of view characters on different sides of the battle, and there are no good guys, there are no bad guys. There are just people maneuvering for their own self-interest and doing their best to survive through the battle. I think the entire book only takes place over like 3 or 4 days. Joe Abercrombie manages to make every action sequence about the characters, and yet it's still completely action-packed and exciting. I could not tear my eyes away from these pages. I felt like I couldn't do anything else while I was reading this book. I just did not want to put it down. Even though these middle 3 books are called standalone books within the First Law world, they're not standalone in the sense of, like, they still happen chronologically. They're not entry points to the series. Like, you still need to read them all in order because each book references characters and events that took place in the previous books. And so I think if you dove in, like, you could still enjoy this book for what it is, but you wouldn't really understand the deeper happenings and why these characters might matter more so than if you started with it. But we do see a lot of characters that we saw in previous books, like Black Dow and the Dogman and Call Shivers and Baez and so on. But our point of view characters in this book are characters that we have not had points of view from before. The point of view characters are Kerndon Craw, Brimmer Dan Gorst, Prince Calder, Corporal Tunney, Red Beck, and Fenry Dan Brock. Like I said, they're on different sides of the battle, and this book just does such a great job of talking about how pointless and wasteful wars are. Also, just how terrifying and brutal they are for the people that are involved. There was a quote that I highlighted as I was reading it that I thought really encapsulated that well, that said, basically, war is all about rich men's ambitions and poor men's graves. It's hard to talk about any plot points within this book without giving something significant away, but just know that this was not only my favorite book in the First Law world so far, it was also my favorite book of the month. Absolutely loved The Heroes. And then the very last thing I wanted to mention was that I did get halfway through Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes, which is book 1. So this was originally published as 2 separate books. The sequel was published 10 years after the first book. In our modern day, they're published as one cohesive novel, even though they're 2 different novels. So I finished the first novel this month, and I did a whole video about that, which I will link down below, so I won't really go into my thoughts about that, but I had a lot of thoughts. So definitely check out that video if you want to hear more about Don Quixote. So that is everything for the month of January. I did a good job, like, cracking away at my goals for the year right away. I had 10 priority series for the year, and I finished one, started one, and made progress on another, so that all feels really good. And I also had a goal of reading 10 new releases in 2024, and I've already read 1 new release with the Emily Wilde book. So feeling really solid on all of my reading goals thus far, and looking forward to some really great reads in February. Let me know in the comments down below if you've read any of these books, or if you haven't, what was your favorite read of the month of January. Thank you so much for tuning in and hanging out with me for a little bit today. As always, please be kind, read books, and hit the subscribe button below for more bookish content to come. I'll see you soon.